Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. You know, Jacob Vidrine is a little bit of an encyclopedia of Mormon fundamentalism. So it's a fun conversation. We're continuing on with Jacob because we didn't get to finish last week. We only got about a third of the way through. And so we're going to dive in more into LeBaron history, which is a lot of other fundamentalist history too. So check it out. Welcome back to Gospel Tangents. Last time we didn't finish our conversation with Jacob Vidrine of the Church of the Firstborn. Is that?
Yep.
Okay. And then, so we're going to continue on. I thought we could kind of summarize a little bit about what we were talking about really quickly. So just to summarize, the LeBaron Church is in Mexico. You've got, and you correct me if I make any mistake. Or maybe I should have you do it.
Yeah.
But we've got Joel LeBaron and Herbal LeBaron, and Herbal kills Joel.
I don't think we even got that far.
Oh, you haven't even got that far.
So yeah, we haven't gotten to the Mexico church being established yet. What we kind of talked about, and this was in the last time, the last day we met to record. But I thought we had a good kind of first part of the interview where we talked about how Joseph Smith was kind of introducing some newer ideas about priesthood in Nauvoo near the end of his life. And some of those ideas kind of dropped off later. Some of them kept kind of continuing on to a degree. And what was very interesting was that Benjamin F. Johnson seemed to have a desire for those things from Nauvoo, like the Council of 50, to continue. And he felt that the priesthood that he received was significant, that there was this charge given to the Council of 50. And there's this peculiar claim from one of his grandsons that he passed on priesthood authority to him. And that grandson, we kind of covered that he kind of spent his life trying to live in Mexico. And
that was Almadeir LeBaron.
Yep,
right?
Almadeir LeBaron tried to establish his life and his family, living plural marriage in Mexico. And we kind of covered the kind of, near the end of his life, we covered his interaction with other fundamentalists because there was a lot of kind of overlap and cross interaction early on with the fundamentalist movement. And that's always a fascinating subject for me to talk about. And you like talking about all the different groups interacting as well.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Could it be argued that because it went from, was it Joel to Alma?
But Benjamin Johnson to Alma.
Oh, it went from Benjamin Johnson to Alma.
And he kind of skipped over the father.
Exactly. Right. Could it be argued that that line was broken and that Alma, I wouldn't expect you to argue that, but have you heard maybe people who are critics of LeBaron's, to say, well, was there really an ordination there between Benjamin Johnson and Almadeir LeBaron?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of those arguments, and I think what we talked about with Almadeir LeBaron's father, Benjamin Franklin LeBaron, is he was in the church his whole life, but he had a quasi-fundamentalist viewpoint where he, had beliefs in plural marriage. He had beliefs in, he made a statement we talked about where he talked about how he was not very happy about the different changes to the temple garment that were happening under Heber J. Grant. And he was supportive of his son kind of going into fundamentalist direction, or at least some level of familial support there where he still, was at friendly interactions with his son and his grandchildren. But with I think what the LeBarons have used to argue kind of in defense of that, it's like they would say like Jacob blesses Manasseh and Ephraim and appoints the birthright to Ephraim, kind of like, even though so Joseph is in Egypt, right? And so he's kind of skipping over the son and the grandfather is appointing the birthright to the grandson, sort of thing. And so there's different analogies like that in Old Testament that they would use to kind of point to that. But one of the things that is interesting to me that kind of substantiates, I think, that that Almadeir LeBaron's claim was that he claimed that he was given very young, that Benjamin F. Johnson charged a neighbor friend of his to give a box of his most special papers to Dair LeBaron when he became, a little bit older. I think Johnson was, Dair was probably in his early 20s when Johnson passed away. Or I think maybe he wasn't even 20 years old. He was pretty young still. And so the family tradition is that he charged him when he was about 25 years old to give him a box of his most precious papers. And there was all these copies of like poetry and letters that were precious to the family. And one of the things that really stood out to Dare was a letter that Benjamin F. Johnson wrote to George S. Gibbs, who was a secretary and church historian, and his father was secretary to the first presidency. And so the family tradition is that letter was very special and significant to Dare LeBaron, and he really prized that letter, and he had a bunch of copies made. And that's actually the earliest. So Dare later almost lost the box, is what the family said, and so he went and he donated the papers to the church historians because he didn't want to risk losing them again. And now nobody knows what actually happened to that box. But the one thing that was in it that I believe has been preserved was the letter to George S. Gibbs that Benjamin F. Johnson wrote. And so that letter is still in, the church's possession. And so that's kind of, one of the evidences for that box. But because, that's the thing that I think kind of substantiates Dare's claims is that, why would Johnson be leaving a random grandson, a bunch of special papers, including this letter he wrote to the first presidency, essentially about early church history, plural marriage, and succession, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So there's a couple other things. I think that there's the uniqueness of Dare's claims that really kind of makes it stand out. In Utah Mormonism, it was all about apostleship. And so that was kind of detrimental to Dare's claims initially because he's claiming authority from someone who was kind of a nobody in Utah Mormonism. Benjamin F. Johnson, most people don't even know who he was.
Right.
And so, most fundamentalists coalesced around Lauren Woolley because he's got this connection in his family. Like John Taylor stayed in his house. His father said he was very close with John Taylor, and he claimed this apostleship line coming from John Taylor. And so that drew a lot more people to that because that kind of fit in with Utah Mormonism's emphasis on the apostles a lot more than, say, Dare's claim that, hey, my grandfather claimed that he was given special authority from Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, and he passed that authority and this birthright to me. And most people would be like, what? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Right. And this claim of patriarchal priesthood, I guess, is one of the big things that those early sources in LeBaron history talk about. Because most people, I would say, in Utah Mormonism haven't even, if you say patriarchal priesthood, they'll be kind of like, what? That sounds unfamiliar or
right. Let's talk about the origins of power because Mike Quinn talks about it.
Yeah, Quinn talks about it a little bit. And so, but most people might only think of like church patriarch and not really connect the idea of Joseph Smith and Nauvoo talking about like a temple patriarchal priesthood that related to these higher temple ordinances that Joseph was doing. And so unless you have that historical context of like Council of 50, Last Charge, patriarchal priesthood, it just kind of doesn't sound familiar. And so Dare wasn't really successful at kind of sharing his claims in a way to convert people to accepting them during his lifetime, if that makes sense.
Okay.
But where we kind of left off was we were talking about in the 1950s, Dare dies in the early 1950s, and his sons kind of, most of the sons in Mexico initially are with what came to be known as the All Red Group or the AUB later on, when the split is started. Mm-hmm. But Ross, who had been ordained by Dare in 1950, he kind of immediately starts, after getting his commission to teach, he starts teaching people about patriarchal priesthood. And he has this idea of it's this priesthood above the church. It's the priesthood that Moses, Elias, and Elijah restored in the Kirtland Temple. And he had this very unique cosmology where he said that this was to make men to hold this temple authority for their own families. He said that this big mission was to ordain patriarchs, to hold these patriarchal keys. And so this is kind of a very contrast to, there's kind of tension in the Lauren Woolley fundamentalist cosmology on this priesthood structure, where they have this council of high priest apostles that are above everything. And there's questions about where's the checks and balances to all the priesthood being in this council that's above the church and not really subject to anything. And so what Ross's cosmology of priesthood above the church was instead, this patriarchal priesthood, was that there can be lots of men who hold this highest authority, for their own family spheres. And so that's kind of one of the checks and balances to the higher priesthood, was that there was a dissemination of authority rather than, say, all the authority concentrated into a council or one person, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And I would say that that ties back to what Joseph was doing with kings and priests in Nauvoo, where lots of men were being given this higher authority above the church. And so this was Ross's claim, and so he started ordaining men as patriarchs in the early 1950s.
Was Ross generally recognized as the most likely successor? Because Dyer did not officially pick a successor. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of
Joseph Smith in that respect.
Yeah. So that's kind of, I see that as, that's how I interpret the historical data. I'm sure there's other people who would interpret it differently, but I've collected a lot of sources on the LeBaron history, and so I see that there didn't have a clear succession. That's why you have three different sons making three different claims. You have Ben, who was the mentally unwell oldest son. You have Ross as the second oldest. And then later on, Joel starts to make his claim in 1955.
And where does Ervil fit in all this?
And Ervil supports Joel initially. We'll talk a little bit more about Ervil.
Is he younger?
Yeah, he's one of the younger sons. And Ervil and Joel in the 1950s, early 1950s, are supporters of the All Red group at that point. And so that's why some of those histories say that the LeBaron split from the All Reds, is because Joel and Ervil and the family in Mexico were initially part of the new council. So what was unique, one of the other unique things with Ross was, at the time in the 1950s, a lot of fundamentalists still had this idea, which goes back to Lauren Woolley and the origins of fundamentalism, that we're just keeping plural marriage alive until the church gets set in order. The church is still the church, and we're just carrying on these certain things that the church is not continuing anymore. But eventually there'll be a reconciliation. We'll be able to go back into the church.
So who took the church out of order? Was it Woodruff, Joseph F. Smith, or Heber J. Grant? According to you.
According to me, I think that there's different degrees, and I kind of think that things start to go a little bit out of order at Joseph Smith's death, where I think that Joseph died unexpectedly without a clear succession laid out.
And so that's why we got to go back to the Council of 50 to get the true authority. Is that why?
I would say that Brigham Young tried to do his best to carry on what Joseph had taught him, and same with John Taylor and the other men who were faithful to Joseph's teachings. But the saints, there was a hard time with how do all of Joseph's teachings that he was introducing in Nauvoo fit together, and how do we lay these out in a way for the saints in general to be brought into these newer teachings and organizations. And so Brigham kind of makes comments throughout his life about the law of adoption, which was a big aspect that that was one thing we didn't mention, was that, in the 1840s, especially on the Trek West, there was a teaching that was known as the law of adoption, where different families, men would be sealed to men, this linking of men in the priesthood to each other, father-son relationships, and even families being linked.
Why John D. Lee was adopted and sealed to Brigham Young as a son, even though John D. Lee was actually older than Brigham Young.
Yeah, I'm not sure if John D. Lee was, maybe he was, but there were men that were older than Brigham Young who were adopted to him. Yeah. And basically that was kind of tying into this celestial family order being established on earth. There was this idea about the sealings in the 1840s that kind of continued up until 1894, when Woodruff did away with adoption, where they were like, we need to work out our sealed family relationships here on earth. And And so that involved, like, if your parents didn't accept the gospel, then you should find parents in the gospel to be sealed to, to be your parents in heaven, sort of thing.
Because the idea was, if your parents didn't like the church, they're going to have the same attitude in heaven. So I can't trust. I mean, now in the LDS Church, we trust that, you seal everybody to the parents. But back in the 1840s, we were like, no, they're not going to accept the gospel. They rejected the gospel. I want to be sealed to somebody like Brigham Young or Joseph Smith so that I can get those sealing blessings.
Yep, it was, that was the general attitude, that was considered unsafe to seal yourself to somebody who you don't know is on the path to be in the celestial kingdom by accepting the gospel. And so in a similar way, it was like with women, the teaching was that you need to have a faithful priesthood holder husband to be sealed to. So if a woman's husband doesn't accept the gospel, there was this idea that she needs to be sealed to a priesthood holder for eternity, even if she has a 4-time husband that's not a member of the church. Was kind of this tied into that kind of concept of, you got to figure out your heavenly relationships kind of here on earth, rather than expecting that it's going to be worked out on the other side. And so that's kind of how things continue. And so the biggest emphasis on adoption was really in the 1840s on the trek west. They got to Utah, and then there was not quite as much emphasis on it, though Brigham Young still taught it throughout his life. But what he kind of said was that he felt that the saints weren't fully prepared for all of the higher organizations and principles that Joseph had been teaching. He said that he said, even plural marriage, he says, I feel like there's a great many people who are abusing it and it will send thousands to hell. And he said, there's many great and glorious principles of which the people are not fully ready to receive. We have to administer them very carefully to them. And what little they get has to be administered with great care. And so he talked about the law of adoption in that context, where he said that there would be men who would abuse it and try to build up a kingdom to themselves, sort of thing, because of this idea of you're creating a heavenly kingdom here on earth. And so Brigham said there's men who would fellowship unrighteousness and have wicked men be sealed to them, as long as you'll be sealed to me. I don't care what you do, sort of.
Was that a reference to John D. Lee, I wonder?
That's kind of what I think, that was, John D. Lee played a big factor in Brigham de-emphasizing adoption, because a lot of John D. Lee's wives and adopted sons were very unhappy in the winter quarters period. And so Brigham basically said, you got to admit that you've made some faults, you've made some mistakes, John, and basically give everyone their liberty to say, okay, I don't want to be sealed to you anymore if they really don't want to be. And those who do want to continue to be, married or adopted to you, that we can, just let's put the wrongs in the past and move forward better. But they said most of his adopted sons ultimately decided to end their adoption covenants with John D. Lee. And that is what, the book on the Mormon Frontier, The Diaries of Hosea Stout, was Juanita Brooks was the one who edited it. And so she kind of felt in her study of the Trek West that this was when adoption stopped being as publicly taught and emphasized, was due to the John D. Lee trial in, I believe, December of 1847. And so, you start to see these principles start to be de-emphasized later.
This is before Mountain Meadows, though, right?
Yep. Okay. Mountain Meadows was a decade later.
Yeah, and he wasn't tried until 1875,
Yeah, so Wilford Woodruff in 1894 is the one who kind of officially ends the practice of adoption. When they got the temples built in early Utah, it started to be revived among the saints, but there were comments of, do we really understand this as much as we should? I think Wilford Woodruff made a comment in 1887 where he said, we don't understand this as much as we should, but still the sealings and adoptions must be true principles, or our prophets have been badly deceived, is what he said for why they needed to follow these principles, even if they didn't quite understand it as much as they hoped to. I think that in early Utah, Brigham Young was probably the most ardent believer in adoption. And I think after his death, you start to have people kind of being more skeptical of it. And then finally in 1894, Woodruff changes it to what's kind of the church's present policy of it's not universalist, but it's quasi-universalist in a sense, where Woodruff says there's going to be very few people who reject the gospel. And so he's expecting that most of our fathers and ancestors are going to end up in the celestial kingdom, is kind of his attitude. And so, or his justification for why we should just seal the family lines back as far as we can. Okay. And so, you know, in my opinion, I feel like, you know, the loss of adoption being, you know, as an important thing was something that was tragic, because I think it's a very cool and very beautiful principle if done in the proper context, because there's people who have, I mean, with the eternal family doctrine, it can be used as a salesmanship for missionaries to be like, do you love your family? Do you want to be with your family forever? To kind of convert people to the gospel. But the problem comes when people have broken family relationships where they have, where there's been cases of abuse or neglect or other.
And they don't want to be sealed to their family forever.
Yeah, yeah. And so in those cases, that's where adoption really makes a lot more sense, where, you know, you should be able to be, you know, in my opinion, you should be able to make a different relationship for eternity if that is a bad, you know, earthly relationship.
So you're not going with the idea that, oh, my parents might not accept the gospel. You don't accept that reasoning. But in a case where there's abuse and you don't want, and a child doesn't want to be sealed to his parents, that's where adoption would make more sense. Am I right there?
Well, I think that both, because so I personally, in my view of the 3 degrees of glory, it sounds from D&C 76, it sounds like the celestials very few compared to the, doesn't it say that the telestial kingdom would be the numerous and numerous, while in contrast to the terrestrial and the celestial? And so I personally am skeptical of the idea that everyone's going to the celestial kingdom. It's just kind of my personal, I mean, you know,
you've got 3 degrees in the celestial kingdom too, right?
Yeah.
The top's for the polygamous, or is the bottom for the polygamous?
So, you know, there's different views.
I've heard there's
different views of that, even where some people argue that maybe the idea of subdegrees in the celestial kingdom is a later development by Melvin Ballard in the 1920s.
Oh.
And that maybe that we're misinterpreting it's at section 130 or 131, where it says in the celestial glory, there are 3 degrees or glories, and to attain the highest, you must enter into this order of the priesthood. And so there's a different interpretation of that some historians hold. And this is actually, Joel LeBaron actually really emphasized this in contrast to the subdegrees view, was the belief that, you know, that the section is referencing just not subdegrees, but just the regular 3 degrees of glory. In my opinion, there's numerous gradations in the celestial glory, in my kind of opinion.
Because there's the 3-5-7 thing, and I don't know if that really...
Oh, about wives and...
You're going to have 3 to get in the bottom of the celestial kingdom, 5 to get in the middle degree, and then 7 or more to get in the highest degree of the celestial kingdom.
That's kind of a Lauren Woolley cosmology.
That's not a LeBaron thing.
I think that there have been LeBarons who've accepted some form of that. And Ross did articulate something similar to that at some point, but he said that these are celestial patterns that aren't necessarily attained on earth, was kind of his perspective on it.
So monogamists are just going to make it to the terrestrial kingdom under this reasoning. Is that right?
So my view is that it's not the number of wives that gets you into the celestial kingdom. It's, you know, it's how faithful you are to the gospel. And Brigham Young, I think...
But if you only have one wife, is that faithful?
So this is an interesting tangent to our conversation, but Brigham Young, I go off of, you know, where I consider, so some fundamentalists really care about what their group teaches today as being their litmus for what they believe about doctrine. I mean, and there's church members in the LDS Church who have kind of a similar view. My litmus test is, what did Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor teach? And what Brigham Young taught, and which Lyman White also was teaching in Texas, was that monogamists can go to the celestial kingdom, but that polygamists attain a greater glory in the celestial kingdom. And so Brigham said that those who remain faithful to the end will have all the glory they're able to receive. And Brigham said that if a man is faithful with one wife, so somebody asked if in a question and answers in the School of the Prophets to Brigham. They said, "Can a man not be exalted without a wife or two?" And Brigham said, "You can't put a gallon in a pint measure, but both can be made filled full." He said, "If a man is faithful with one wife, he may grow to be a gallon measure," is what Brigham said. And so
would that mean he will get more wives in the celestial kingdom, like after death?
So the way I kind of harmonize the statements about monogamous in the celestial kingdom with the other statements in early Utah about, you have to live, this is the, part of the celestial law to live plural marriage. The way I harmonize it is that a faithful monogamous, you have to accept plural marriage in your faith.
Okay.
To, as being a true principle. And you, in order to be a God, you will have to eventually practice polygamy, is my personal perspective on harmonizing the two different quotes, because there's like John Taylor got a revelation in October 1882 saying that a man living a lower law cannot preside over a man living, the revelation said, "Is not meet for men who will not abide my law to preside over my priesthood," is what this October 1882 revelation said. And John Taylor commented on that, saying that the leading men must practice, enter into this principle of plural marriage, or else they must stop, i.e. resign from office. And he said, a man living a lower law cannot preside over a man living a higher law, is what he said. And then John Taylor said, if we do not live the same law that our Heavenly Father lives, then we cannot go where he is. And so kind of this emphasis on plural marriage as being, and if you talk to people who practice plural marriage, I've heard repeatedly them say that it's really a refiner of character to try to be living that way. And they do truly see it as a stepping stone to the responsibility of godhood, in that there's a lot more weight of familial responsibility on their shoulders, and they have to be that much more perfect and just and loving in their judgment to keep their whole family happy and intact. And so, they really do see it as kind of a stepping stone to exaltation, as some of the early brethren called it. So, what I like,
diving in deep on the theology. This is great.
Yeah. So with Ross, what I liked about Ross's theology was there really wasn't as much emphasis on plural marriage. He kind of took it for granted, and he was a lot more focused on priesthood rather than plural marriage. And so to get back to my view of, my personal historical view on when the church, lost X, Y, and Z, I think losing adoption kind of started it. I think losing the Council of 50, and then by 1890 with the Manifesto was intended to be a lie to the government, and they kept doing plural marriage after the Manifesto, is what the history really shows. And Quinn really did that massive study on it to
supposedly there's a new book coming out, even though he died. Somebody's finishing it.
Yeah. And I think that was a big contributing factor to what was that published before his excommunication, the whole post-Manifesto plural marriage article.
I think it was after.
But I just know that I heard that different sources say that the church leaders, the apostles, were very unhappy about Quinn had been given all this free access to the archives, and then he goes and publishes all this history of polygamy that they're really not excited to have put out there. And so the Manifesto was intended to be a lie to the government and, to try to get some relief for the church.
Or what a better way to say that was, we're going to stop polygamy in the United States, but if you go to Mexico, we're not going to stop it there.
Yeah, but then they weren't even really strict about that. They're like, well, we're going to go, as long as you keep it on the down low and don't create, it kind of became more of a personal responsibility, is what they said. They said, you can keep doing plural marriage, and you should, and Woodruff would, encourage men in some of those statements. But the idea was, you're doing it on your own responsibility, and you can't put it on the church anymore, is kind of what happened. But what the big thing happened with the Manifesto was there was a threefold change to Mormon teachings with the 1890 Manifesto, and what the I would call political capitulation at that time. The first one is obviously that we're no longer going to, as church leaders, publicly teach plural marriage as necessary for the highest exaltation. And there's a First Presidency statement in 1891 saying, "We formerly taught our members that this principle was required for the highest exaltation in the life to come." Abandon, no longer teaching plural marriage. The second one was to stop to no longer be doing this kind of independent political thing that the church was doing up until 1890, where under Joseph and Brigham and John Taylor up to the 1890s, the Mormons really kind of voted as a political bloc, and they really prized themselves as being united in all things, including politics. And so in early Utah, there was the People's Party, which was the official party of the church. And it was kind of this idea that there shouldn't be a division between church and politics. And they kind of, wanted the priesthood to have influence in political matters. And so after the Manifesto, they abandoned the People's Party and they kind of adopted an official, general, politically neutral view, is what church leaders did then.
And supposedly they even signed one family to be Republican and another family to be Democrats.
Yeah, there's those stories where they said that they divided up the pews and said, this half you're going to be Republicans, this half you're going to be Democrats. And, there started to be some big kind of political division in the church very shortly after that. And
Utah used to be a swing state, which I wish we'd go back to that. But personally.
And so then the third thing that happened with the 1890 Manifesto was the church's economic, they call it the economic control or dominion that they had in Utah, also needed to be scaled back.
More consecration.
Yeah. So the church basically stopped, dictating to members what they should be doing in their temporal business affairs. Like Brigham Young in his day and Joseph had different controversies with members when they gave revelations that would dictate in temporal things, like to consecrate or be involved with united firms in Joseph's day. And Brigham, he did the economic cooperatives in the late 1860s and got the United Orders going again. And so, in the 1890s, they were saying that, to be more integrated with the United States, you got to stop being this politically separate thing. You got to stop being this economic, merging economics with your church kind of thing. And then the third thing was that we don't want plural marriage to continue. We consider that contrary to our values as a country. And so, I don't think that, and the LeBaron tradition has generally not thought that the church lost everything with the Manifesto. But the idea is maybe the higher things were lost at that point, but the church still kept all of the first principles, the basics of the gospel still continued with the church. And that's kind of very similar to what I think a lot of fundamentalists hold a position, that they view that the church is still keeping alive some things and that the higher things are being kept alive by our separate authority, whichever authority line fundamentalist believes in, sort of thing. And so that was a good kind of tangent.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jacob Vidrine from the Church of Firstborn. In our next conversation, we're going to dive into the 1950s LeBaron splits.
And in this document, they sustain Ross Wesley LeBaron as holding all the keys he had received from his father and the calling he received from his father, and sustained him as head patriarch in this Church of the Firstborn of the fullness of times. And Joel was actually ordained in that meeting to be president of the Church of the Firstborn of the fullness of times. And then Florin was set apart as a counselor, and so Ross is merely sustained in his calling that he had received from their father, while Joel and Florin, the younger brothers, were ordained by Ross, basically. And so what Ross said is that he ordained both of them to be patriarchs and to have these offices in the church. And he said what happened shortly after that was that Joel, like a week later, decides that he's going to, basically felt like Joel wanted to claim to be the real person that's in charge instead of Ross.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.